At 4 a.m., while kneading dough alone in my bakery, my phone suddenly rang. I almost ignored it until I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. Dad, please, I need your help. 5 years earlier, my daughter had married a wealthy man, walked out of my life, and never called again. No birthdays, no holidays, nothing. Then just hours after my bakery appeared in a major newspaper, she came back with tears in her voice. As I listened, an old friend quietly asked, "How long after the article was published did she call?" That question changed everything. Welcome back to Dad's Calm Revenge. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment for me. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Right now I read your comments more than you think. A quick note, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling purposes. What matters most is the message it carries. My hands were buried wrist deep in sourdough when the phone on the steel shelf began to buzz. 4 in the morning. The kitchen of my Gloucester Harbor bakery was dark, except for the work light above my station. I'd been kneading the first batch for 20 minutes, long enough that the dough had started pushing back against my palms with that specific resistance that means it's almost ready. The phone's vibration against metal made a sound like an angry insect. I looked at the screen. Unknown number. 60 years old, and I've learned that unknown numbers at 4 a.m. carry only two kinds of news. Someone's died or someone wants money. I wiped flour from my right hand onto my apron and answered without speaking. Dad. One word. Just that. But I would have recognized my daughter's voice if she'd called from the bottom of the ocean. Solane. I said nothing. My hand, the one not holding the phone, found its way back to the dough. I know I don't deserve this, she continued. Her voice was thick the way voices get when you've been crying for hours. I know what I did. I know I said things I can't take back. But Dad, he betrayed me. Corbin. He everything I thought we had. Everything I gave up for him. It was all... She broke off into something between a sob and a laugh. I'd heard that sound once before 10 years ago when her mother was dying. I have nowhere else to go. I have nobody. Please, I need to come home. 3 minutes? That's how long she talked. I didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, just stood in my dark bakery with flour on my hands and my daughter's voice in my ear, listening to her describe a marriage that had apparently dissolved to overnight debts she couldn't specify, mistakes she wouldn't name. When she finally stopped, the silence stretched. Are you still there? I looked at the steel counter where my left hand had been resting. There was a perfect handprint in flour, 5 fingers, clear as a photograph. Then I set the phone down gently on the shelf, not hanging up, just setting it down. Her voice continued tinny and distant. Dad, please, Dad! I went back to kneading. The dough was forgiving. It always is. You can leave it come back, and if you handle it right, it doesn't remember the interruption. People are different. 5 years, 2 months, and if I'm being honest, 11 days. Not that I was counting. That's how long it had been since Celine walked out of my life. March 2019. She'd stood in the doorway of this same bakery and told me I was small, that I'd always be small, that she'd found someone who understood ambition, someone who wanted more than flour and early mornings and the smell of bread that never quite washes out of your clothes. She'd married Corbin 6 weeks later. I wasn't invited. No birthday calls after that, no holidays. After March 2019, complete silence. The kind of silence that eventually stops hurting and just becomes the shape of your life. Until 4 a.m. on a Monday in July when my phone started buzzing. I finished the first batch, covered it, started the second. By the time I heard the delivery truck in the alley, I'd almost convinced myself the call had been a dream. But when I picked up the phone, the call log showed 37 minutes. She'd stayed on the line for half an hour after I set it down. Eventually, she'd hung up. No voicemail. 3 hours later, the bakery was open. July morning, light poured through the front windows, and the smell of baking sourdough had transformed the space from my private cave into something public and warm. Customers came and went. I smiled, made change, wrapped loaves in paper. At 7 exactly, Eugene Caldwell walked through the door. 63 years old. Eugene had the kind of face that made you think of sailors and storms, weathered, lined with pale blue eyes that seemed permanently focused on some distant horizon. He'd been coming to my bakery every single morning for 5 years, always taking the same stool at the far end of the counter, always ordering black coffee and whatever bread I recommended. I'd never asked what he did for a living. He'd never volunteered. Some friendships are built on conversation. Ours was built on comfortable silence. But that morning, pouring his coffee, I found myself talking. She called this morning, I said. After 5 years, not a word since March 2019. No holidays, no birthdays, nothing. Then 4 a.m. unknown number, and it's Celine. Eugene's hand was steady around the mug. He didn't look surprised, just nodded slowly the way you nod when someone confirms something you already suspected. How long after the Globe article went live did she call? He asked. I blinked. The question was so specific it took me a moment to process. Yesterday afternoon, the Boston Globe had published a business section feature on regional artisan bakeries. My face had been on page 3 next to a paragraph about how the Golden Crust had grown from 1 location to 8 in 5 years, with estimated brand value of $22 million. I'd hated that number the moment I saw it. Hated how it reduced 30 years of 4 a.m. mornings into a figure that could be printed in a newspaper. 9 hours, I said slowly. Maybe 10. Article went live at 6 p.m. yesterday. She called at 4 this morning. Eugene set his mug down. The sound of ceramic against laminate was very loud in the quiet bakery. He nodded once, a sharp movement, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise, but confirmation. The look of a man who'd made a prediction and just watched it come true. Interesting, he said. That was all. Just that one word. But the way he said it, quiet, measured like a doctor, noting a symptom, made something cold settle in my chest. Some people look at a situation and immediately see the entire canvas. Why had Eugene always seen the things I missed? I watched him take another sip of his coffee, his weathered hand steady around the ceramic mug. For 5 years he'd sat at that same stool every single morning, arriving before the first customers, staying through the early rush. I'd always thought it was friendship. That morning, staring at his unsurprised face, I began to wonder if it had been something else entirely. The newspaper with my face on the business section sat folded on the counter between us, and the number $22 million seemed to glow in the morning light. After Eugene left that morning, I locked the office door and sat alone with the newspaper. The number sat there on page 3 of the Boston Globe business section, black ink on newsprint, $22 million. Estimated brand value of the Golden Crust artisan bakery chain, 8 locations across Massachusetts. There was a photograph of me standing in front of the original bakery at dawn, arms crossed. The photographer had caught me at the wrong angle. I looked like a man who had something worth taking. I read the article 3 times. Each time the weight of that number grew heavier. Not because it was wrong, if anything it was conservative, but seeing it in print was different. Seeing it where anyone could read it, where my estranged daughter could see exactly what her father was worth on paper, that changed everything. I opened my desk drawer. Beneath the folders and lease agreements, there was a small scrap of paper, edges yellowed, covered in Helena's slanted handwriting. I'd found it in her apron pocket 3 days after she died, 10 years ago, this past April. When the dough rises correctly, I know you've done it right. That was all. Just that one sentence on the back of an old receipt. I didn't know what she'd meant when she wrote it, or if it was meant for me at all. But I'd kept it. I held it now, feeling the thin paper between my fingers. 9 hours. Celine had waited 9 hours after this article went to print before calling me. Not 6 years. Not on my birthday or Christmas or the anniversary of her mother's death. 9 hours after the Boston Globe told her exactly what I was worth. Helena would have said this was the price of success. She'd have been wrong. This was the price of visibility. I folded the note and slid it into my breast pocket. Then I picked up my phone and called a number I'd hoped I'd never need. I called the investigator before I called my daughter back. Some people would say that makes me a terrible father. Those people have never been used before. 3 days later, Thursday afternoon, I sat in a cramped office above a Thai restaurant in Salem. The sign on the door read, Norwood Investigations. Inside, the space smelled like pad thai and stale coffee. Grant Norwood was 45 and unremarkable by design. Medium height, medium build. The kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. That was probably why he was good at his job. He slid a manila folder across his desk with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just documented a perfect betrayal. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I answer her call. I'd told him on Monday. 5 days, can you do it in 5? He'd done it in 4. I opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, Corbin Harrington, my son-in-law, sitting at a blackjack table in Atlantic City. The timestamp read, April 2024, 3 months ago. There were more photographs, different casinos, different tables, always the same man with his tie loosened and his expression tense. Your son-in-law has a problem, Grant said. $3.2 million worth. I turned the page. A debt agreement printed on letterhead from XYZ Capital Management, a private lending firm registered with the SEC. Principal amount $3,200,000. Interest rate 18% annually. Signature at the bottom, Corbin James Harrington. Date May 15, 2024. 2 months ago, right around the time Selene would have started planning her reconciliation. I kept reading. The next document made my hands go cold. Letter of intent. Meridian Hospitality Group. Purchase of the Golden Crust brand assets, including but not limited to trademark recipes, supplier contracts, customer databases, lease assignments for all 8 locations. Purchase price $18 million. Seller signature Corbin James Harrington. Date June 20th, 2024. I looked up. Grant was watching me. He doesn't own the Golden Crust, I said quietly. No. Grant agreed. But the LOI assumes he will, soon. It's valid for exactly 45 days from signature. That gives him until August 4th to deliver legal ownership, or the deal collapses and Meridian walks. I stared at the document. June 20th. That was 2 weeks before the Globe article. 2 weeks before Selene called crying about her marriage falling apart. This wasn't desperation. This was a timetable. What do they want? I asked. Grant leaned back. Everything. The brand, the recipes, the real estate. Meridian's been trying to break into the artisan market for 3 years. Your operation is perfect established customer base, premium locations, genuine reputation. They're not just buying bakeries, they're buying legitimacy. And Corbin gets $18 million, I said softly. Pays off his debt, walks away with $14.8 million clear, minus whatever he's promised your daughter. I closed the folder. My hands were steady. That surprised me. How much time do I have? The LOI expires August 4th. That's 41 days from today. Grant paused. But if your daughter moves back into your house and establishes herself as your primary caregiver, or heir apparent, Corbin's attorneys could argue she has legal standing to make decisions on your behalf, especially if something were to happen to you, especially if you were to become... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 45 days. How do you dismantle a conspiracy with a 6-week fuse when the conspirators are already living in your house? I stood, shook Grant's hand, paid him in cash, walked out into the July heat with the manila folder under my arm. The sky opened up before I reached my truck. Rain came down in sheets. I sat in the cab with the engine running and the folder on the passenger seat, watching water stream down the windshield. 45 days. I turned on my phone and dialed Eugene. Can you meet me at the shop before opening tomorrow? I asked when he answered. What time? 4 a.m. A second of silence, then, I'll bring the coffee. I drove home through the rain, the dossier sealed in its envelope beside me. The trap was about to be designed, and I needed the one man who had never asked me a single question in 5 years to finally start answering some of mine. I didn't go to bed when I got home that Thursday night. Instead, I stood in my kitchen with the manila envelope still in my hand, staring at nothing. Then I opened the coat closet and took down the apron. The apron still smelled faintly of flour, even after 10 years hanging on the hook behind my kitchen door. Helena's apron, white canvas stained with decades of use, the ties frayed at the ends. I'd hung it there the day after her funeral and never touched it again, never washed it, never moved it, just left it hanging where she'd always kept it, like a piece of her that refused to disappear. I sat down on the kitchen floor and pulled the apron over my head, tied the strings behind my back. The canvas was cool against my shirt. The flour smell was so faint, I might have imagined it, but I didn't think so. Some things don't wash out. That's when the memory hit me. Selene, at 6 years old, standing on a wooden stool in this same kitchen. Her hands too small to grip the mixing bowl properly, flour everywhere on the counter, on her shirt smudged across her cheeks. She'd looked up at me with those serious brown eyes and said in that solemn voice children use when they're making declarations, "When I grow up, I'm gonna bake with you, Daddy." Behind her, Helena had been covering her mouth with one hand, trying not to laugh. The afternoon light had come through the window at that perfect angle, golden and warm. Everything whole, everything right. I sat on my kitchen floor at 11 p.m. and held that memory like a knife. That little girl with flour on her face was the one who poisoned my flour jar. That little girl who promised to bake with me forever was the one who called 9 hours after seeing my net worth in print. That little girl I'd loved from the second she was born, she was gone. Had been gone for years. I had to remember she existed, and I had to remember she was gone. The clock ticked past midnight. I didn't move, just sat there on the cold tile wearing my dead wife's apron, holding a memory of my daughter in one hand and the knowledge of her betrayal in the other. Then I stood, untied the apron, hung it back on its hook. I went upstairs and slept for 3 hours. The next morning, driving to the shop at 4 a.m., the pain was gone. Not because it had vanished, but because I had decided what I was going to do with it. Eugene was already there when I arrived, standing in the alley behind the bakery with 2 paper cups of coffee from the all-night diner. He handed me one without speaking. I unlocked the door, and we went inside. The kitchen was dark and cold. I flipped on the overhead lights and led Eugene to the long stainless steel table where I did prep work. I set the manila envelope between us. He set his coffee down and opened it. For 10 minutes, Eugene read every page in complete silence. The photographs, the debt agreement, the letter of intent. His weathered face showed nothing. When he finished, he set the pages down in a neat stack and took a slow sip of coffee. Then he reached across the table and grabbed a sheet of wax paper from the roll I kept, mounted on the wall, the kind I used for recipe notes, and pulled a pen from his shirt pocket. "You want to catch them?" he said flatly. "Not just drive them away? There's a massive difference." I leaned forward. "I want evidence, enough so no lawyer on earth can untangle them from it." Eugene nodded slowly. He drew a horizontal line across the wax paper, then divided it into sections. "Then do it right. Do it once. And first you need to call Desmond. Desmond Prescott, my attorney." "Yes." Eugene drew another line, creating a grid. "You need legal structure around this, or they'll slip through. Desmond knows estate law, corporate acquisition, and he knows how to document intent." I watched him work. His hand moved with surprising precision, steady, methodical, each mark deliberate. He wasn't asking questions, wasn't expressing shock. He was designing something. "They think they have 41 days. Eugene continued writing numbers beside each section. "That's their timeline. That's their weakness. They believe they're operating on a clock you can't see, but now you can see it, which means you can manipulate it." "How?" He looked up. His pale blue eyes were calm. "By giving them exactly what they want, slowly, carefully, one piece at a time, while documenting every single step." We were building a snare out of legal paperwork and human greed, and Eugene was sketching it the same way I'd sketch the layers of a complicated pastry, methodically, with precision, one step, dependent on the last. "Step 1, he said, tapping the first box on his diagram. "Desmond files protective documents, ironclad will, healthcare directives, power of attorney explicitly revoking any previous claims, dated and witnessed. Do it Monday. Step 2, you answer your daughter's call. You let her come home." I must have made some sound because Eugene looked up again. "If she's not in your house," he said quietly, "she can't incriminate herself. You want evidence? Then you need to let her try." He went back to sketching, added more boxes, more arrows, more notes in the margins. By the time he finished, the wax paper was covered with an 8-step diagram that looked like a blueprint for something complicated and irreversible. He slid it across the steel table. I picked it up carefully. "Now this will work?" I asked. Eugene took another sip of coffee. "If you follow it exactly, if you don't improvise, if you remember that the second you deviate from this plan, they win." I looked at the diagram, then at Eugene's weathered face in the dim light of 4 a.m. For 5 years, I'd watched him sit at that end stool every morning, and only now was I beginning to understand that he'd been watching me just as carefully. The first step on Eugene's diagram had a single word written in block capitals, Desmond. I stared at that single word, Desmond, and felt the weight of 5 years pressing down on the wax paper. 5 years earlier, my daughter stood at the threshold of the Victorian home with a suitcase in her hand and Corbin's car idling at the curb. March 2019, a Saturday afternoon. I remember because Saturdays were the days Helena and I used to spend in the kitchen together, and the empty space where she should have been standing felt like a physical wound. Solene wouldn't meet my eyes. Just stood there in the doorway with her leather suitcase, the one I'd bought her for college graduation, and stared at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. Outside, Corbin sat behind the wheel of his BMW engine running, waiting. "You don't have to do this," I said. She finally looked at me then. Her face was calm, not angry, not sad. Just calm, like she was explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "Your poverty and the smell of cheap flour are staining my future," she said. Don't look for me again. I stood there frozen. Those words, I can still recite them, syllable for syllable, the way you remember the exact phrasing of a diagnosis or a verdict. Your poverty, cheap flour, staining. As if I were a mark on her clothes she needed to wash out. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. Just watched as she turned away, dragging her suitcase down the front walk, the wheels catching on the brick path Helena and I had laid together 20 years ago. Corbin didn't get out to help her, didn't even look at me. Just waited until she was in the passenger seat, then pulled away from the curb. I closed the door, walked to the kitchen, put on my apron, and began kneading dough. My hands shook so violently the first 10 minutes that flour scattered across the counter in little clouds. But they didn't stop. I kneaded for an hour straight, working the dough until my forearms burned and my fingers cramped. That batch turned out to be the best of the month. I didn't understand then why that batch was the best. Now I do. A man does his finest work when he has nothing else left to hold on to. 1 month later, April 2019, I stood in front of an empty commercial property at 11 o'clock at night in pouring rain. I'd signed the lease that morning, used the last of Helena's life insurance payout as the deposit. The space was bare concrete floors, exposed pipes, dark windows that reflected nothing but my own silhouette standing on the sidewalk. I had the keys in my pocket, but I hadn't gone inside yet. Just stood there staring through the glass, at emptiness, trying to convince myself I could fill it with something that mattered. The rain came down hard. I was soaked through. Didn't care. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. A man stepped up beside me, weathered build rain jacket with the hood-up face I didn't recognize. He stood close enough that I could tell he was looking at the same empty space I was looking at. "It's planning to open a bakery here?" he asked. I glanced at him. Couldn't see much of his face in the darkness and rain, just pale eyes and the rough texture of someone who'd spent years working outdoors. "Trying to," I said. He nodded slowly, still staring through the window. "I know a thing or two about bookkeeping, if you need a hand." I should have asked why. Should have asked who he was, what he was doing. Standing in the rain at 11 p.m. outside a vacant commercial property, why he was offering help to a complete stranger. But I was 55 years old, recently widowed, recently abandoned by my only child, staring at an empty room that represented either the beginning of something or the end of everything. So I just said thank you. We stood there together for another 5 minutes, rain hammering the pavement, neither of us speaking. Then he turned to me. "It's coming down hard," he said. "Want to grab coffee somewhere?" We went to the all-night diner 2 blocks away, sat in a booth by the window. He told me his name was Eugene Caldwell, said he was retired. Navy, did freelance accounting work, lived alone. I told him about Helena, about the bakery I wanted to build in her memory, about how I'd been baking bread since I was 20 years old, and it was the only thing I'd ever been good at. I didn't tell him about Celine, didn't mention that my daughter had left 1 month ago after calling me poor and saying my profession stained her future. Some wounds were too fresh. Eugene helped me build that bakery, showed up every day for 6 months while I renovated the space, managed the books, helped me apply for permits and licenses and health inspections. Never asked for payment, just showed up with coffee every morning at 4 a.m. and worked until the job was done. By the time we opened in October 2019, he'd become part of the foundation of the place. That end stool at the counter might as well have had his name carved into it. 5 years, 8 branches, and my face in the Boston Globe. Eugene sat at the end of the counter every morning, as if he were built into the foundation of the shop. There are coincidences, and there are things designed to look like coincidences. What kind of man stands in the rain at 11 p.m. outside a stranger's empty storefront and offers help without being asked? A good Samaritan, or someone who already knows exactly who you are. 5 years later, sitting at that steel baking table at 4 a.m. with Eugene's trap diagram sketched on wax paper between us, I look back at that rainy night in April 2019 with entirely different eyes. The question wasn't why he helped me build the bakery. The question was why he had been standing there in the first place. I folded the wax paper carefully and slid it into my shirt pocket next to Helena's note about dough rising correctly. Eugene finished his coffee and stood without speaking. We didn't discuss the diagram further, didn't need to. The first step was clear. That evening, I picked up my phone and called my daughter. She answered on the first ring, her voice thick with hope and something that might have been relief. "Dad, I forgive you," I said. My voice was steady. I meant it in a way she didn't yet understand. She'd cried on the phone when I said I forgave her, asked if she could come home. I'd said yes without hesitation, my voice warm and steady, exactly the way a father's voice should sound. 3 hours later, I watched their black SUV turn onto my street. The black SUV turned onto my street at 2:47 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, luggage strapped to the roof rack, and I watched it approach from the Victorian home's front window, with my phone still warm in my hand from the call I'd made 3 hours earlier. 1 week. That's all it had taken from her first tearful call at 4 a.m. to this moment, her returning with a vehicle full of belongings and a husband I'd never met. Most people would see desperation in that timeline. I saw choreography. The SUV pulled into the driveway and stopped. Engine off. 2 seconds of stillness. Then the driver's door opened. Corbin Harrington stepped out first. 36 years old, maybe 37. Impeccably dressed in tailored charcoal slacks and a crisp white button-down, despite the July heat. Dark hair styled with just enough product to look effortless. The kind of man who practiced his smile in mirrors until it looked unrehearsed. He walked around the front of the vehicle with the easy confidence of someone who believed he'd already won, stopped at the bottom of my front steps, and looked up at me with an expression of carefully calibrated warmth. Solene emerged from the passenger side a moment later. She looked thinner than I remembered, older. Her hair was different, shorter, professionally styled. She wore sunglasses even though the day was overcast. I could see her hands trembling as she adjusted her purse strap. Corbin climbed the steps first, extended both hands toward me in that two-handed grip politicians use when they want to seem sincere. "Wonderful to finally meet you, sir," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "It's been far too long. I can't tell you how much it means that you're willing to." I looked at his outstretched hands for a long moment, examined them. They were soft, manicured, the hands of someone who'd never done a day of physical work in his life. The hands of someone who'd gambled away more than $3 million at blackjack tables and thought he could steal my life's work to pay the debt. I didn't take them. Instead, I stepped aside and threw the front door wide open. "Come inside," I said. "The living room is ready." Corbin's smile flickered for just a fraction of a second. His hands hung in the air for another beat before he lowered them smoothly as if that had been his intention all along. He glanced back at Selene, a quick look barely perceptible, then turned back to me and nodded. "Thank you," he said. "We're grateful, truly." They came up the steps together. Selene still hadn't looked at me directly. When she reached the top, she paused, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. I could see tears gathering behind her sunglasses. I stepped back and let them enter. I had called her 3 hours earlier, told her I forgave her. My voice was steady, and I meant it in a way. Only it was a way my daughter did not yet understand. Corbin walked into my living room like he owned it. That's the first thing I noticed. Not tentative, not grateful, not humble. He walked in with the posture of someone surveying property he intended to acquire. His eyes moved immediately to the antique furniture. The cherry wood desk in the corner, 18th century. Authenticated worth about $12,000. The grandfather clock Helena's father had given us as a wedding present. The oil paintings on the walls. The Persian rug we'd bought in Boston 30 years ago. I watched his gaze catalog each item with the systematic precision of an appraiser preparing an estate sale inventory. He wasn't admiring my home. He was pricing it. Solene stood just inside the doorway, her shoulders hunched slightly forward. She'd taken off her sunglasses finally. Her eyes were red. She started. "Sit," I said gently, gesturing to the sofa. "You must be tired from the drive." She moved toward the sofa like someone walking through water. Slow, uncertain. Corbin followed her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that probably looked supportive to anyone who didn't know what to watch for. But I knew. I'd spent the last week studying Grant Norwood's photographs. That hand wasn't comfort. It was control. They sat together on the sofa Helena and I had picked out in 1998. Corbin crossed one leg over the other, settling into the cushions with the ease of someone who'd already decided he belonged there. Selene perched on the edge of the seat, her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. I remained standing. "Would you like something to drink?" I asked. "Coffee, water." "Water would be wonderful," Corbin said. "Thank you." Selene just shook her head. I nodded and turned toward the kitchen, but I didn't miss the way Corbin's eyes followed me. Didn't miss how his gaze shifted immediately back to the room, the moment he thought I wasn't looking, continuing his silent inventory. I had forgiven her. That was true. But forgiveness and trust are not the same currency, and I was about to teach my daughter the difference. In the kitchen, I filled 2 glasses with water from the tap. Took my time. Let them sit alone in that living room for a full minute. Let Corbin look at whatever he wanted to look at. Let him start calculating the total value of everything he saw. A baker knows the exact moment when dough becomes bread, when heat and time transform one thing into something it can never return from. Watching Corbin cross my threshold, I thought, this is that moment. When I returned to the living room, Corbin was leaning slightly forward, his elbows on his knees, wearing an expression of concerned attentiveness. The performance had begun. I handed him the glass, set the other on the side table near Solane, even though she hadn't asked for it. Then I closed the front door behind them, with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Corbin stood in the center of my living room, his gaze moving systematically from the antique furniture to the frame photographs to the cherry wood desk in the corner, the exact look I'd seen 100 times on appraisers valuing estate sales. My daughter stood slightly behind him, not quite meeting my eyes. The first test would come that evening, and I already knew exactly what she would do. The test came at 7:15 that evening, exactly as I'd expected. The fire in the living room hearth crackled and popped, despite the July evening, and my daughter sat on the sofa, with her hands folded in her lap, like a penitent preparing confession. I'd built the fire myself, while they unpacked upstairs. Celine had always loved fires in that hearth, even as a child. Helena used to light one every Sunday evening in winter, and Celine would sit on the rug with her homework spread around her, the flames reflecting in her serious brown eyes. I remembered that when I struck the match. Corbin sat beside her now, one arm draped casually along the back of the sofa. Not touching her, but positioned close enough to seem protective. He'd changed into more casual clothes, pressed jeans, a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people spent on an entire outfit. Even in my home, even supposedly humbled, he looked like a man playing the role of humble rather than actually being it. I sat in the armchair across from them, my hands resting on the armrests, and waited. Solene took a breath, let it out slowly, looked at the fire, then at me, then back at the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and measured. "Dad, I need to say something I should have said 5 years ago." I nodded but didn't speak. "I was cruel," she continued. "The things I said when I left about your work, about your life, about the smell of flour, I was cruel and I was wrong." Her eyes were filling with tears, real tears. I thought, though, I'd learned long ago that real tears don't necessarily accompany real emotions. "I spent years under someone else's control," she said, glancing briefly at Corbin before looking back at me. "Not recognizing who I was becoming. I lost myself. I lost you. I lost Mom's memory." The mention of Helena hit exactly where it was designed to hit. Corbin's hand moved to her shoulder, light contact. Barely there, but I saw it. Saw the way his fingers pressed once gently, like a stage director, cueing an actor through a difficult line. "She would be so disappointed in me," Celine whispered. "She taught me to value family, to value honest work, to value the things that matter. And I threw all of that away for..." Her voice broke. She covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook. I watched Corbin watching her. Watched the way he tracked her performance with the focused attention of someone monitoring a critical process. His face showed concern, support, love, all the right expressions at all the right moments. But his eyes were calculating something, measuring, waiting for my response the way a chess player waits to see if an opponent will fall for a trap. Solene looked up at me through her tears. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'm asking anyway. Because you're the only family I have left, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life knowing I destroyed that." Silence filled the living room. The fire crackled. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Somewhere outside, a car drove past. I let the silence stretch for exactly 10 seconds. Then I leaned forward slightly. "Thank you for saying that," I said. My voice was steady, measured, warm enough to sound genuine, controlled enough to reveal nothing. "It took courage." Corbin exhaled. It was barely perceptible, just a soft release of breath through his nose, the kind of involuntary response that comes when tension you've been holding finally releases. His hand lifted from Celine's shoulder, and he settled back into the sofa, his posture relaxing by perhaps half an inch. I saw it, noted it, and my face betrayed absolutely nothing. I watched Corbin's hand on my daughter's shoulder. There's a vast difference between the hand of a protector and the hand of a handler. After 60 years, I know the difference. We talked for another 20 minutes, surface conversation where they'd been living what Celine had been doing for work, vague references to marriage difficulties they'd overcome. Corbin did most of the talking, Celine nodded at appropriate moments, added small details. When prompted, kept her eyes down. I went upstairs to bed at 10:30 p.m. Corbin and Celine took the guest room at the end of the hall. I did not sleep. At my age, you learn that waiting is just another form of work. The motion alert buzzed against my chest at 2:47 a.m. I wasn't sleeping. I had been waiting. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. The screen showed the kitchen camera feed basic security system I'd installed 3 weeks ago. Nothing sophisticated, just motion-activated recording. The feed was grainy black and white, but clear enough. Celine stood in the dark kitchen, wearing her nightgown, bare feet on the tile floor. She moved directly to the desk in the corner, the cherry wood desk Corbin had inventoried with his eyes that afternoon, and opened the drawer. She pulled out Helena's note. I watched her hold it up to the ambient light from the window, tilting it to read the slanted handwriting. She stood there staring at it for 53 seconds. I counted. Then her phone screen illuminated in her other hand, a text judging by the way her eyes moved. From Corbin upstairs, I assumed. She read it. Her expression didn't change. I expected her to put the note back in the drawer. That's what someone following instructions would do. Look at it, confirm what it says. Report back, replace it. Instead, she folded the note carefully and slid it into the pocket of her nightgown. She stood there for another moment, her hand over the pocket. Then she closed the drawer quietly and left the kitchen. I switched off my phone and lay in the darkness. She knew that was her mother's handwriting. I didn't understand why she hid it instead of leaving it there. But I noted it. Why does a woman planning to murder her father steal a piece of paper with her dead mother's handwriting on it? I didn't have an answer that night. I'm still not certain I have one now. I lay in the darkness of my bedroom with the phone screen off, thinking about that 53 seconds she spent staring at Helena's handwriting. The next morning when she came down to breakfast, I watched the pocket of her robe where the note was hidden. She touched it twice, unconscious movements, protective. Whatever that piece of paper meant to her, it wasn't nothing. I had a meeting scheduled with Desmond that morning to finalize the legal architecture of the trap. I left the house at 8:15 Monday morning, while Celine and Corbin were still in their room. Drove to Salem with the windows down and the radio off, thinking about that note folded in my daughter's pocket. Desmond Prescott slid the document across his mahogany conference table at exactly 9 a.m., and I recognized the gesture for what it was, a surgeon presenting a scalpel before making the first incision. Desmond Prescott was 55, with silver hair, and the bearing of a man who had spent 30 years outmaneuvering opposing counsel in courtrooms across Massachusetts. His office occupied the top floor of a brick building on Washington Street, and we met in his conference room before his staff arrived, just the two of us, and a pot of coffee neither of us touched. The document was 32 pages long. The header read, "Transfer of shares for the Golden Crust, Bakery Chain Asset Distribution Agreement." On the surface, Desmond said, tapping the first page with his pen, "this is a standard Massachusetts estate planning document. Everything matches conventional legal structures. POA designation, healthcare, proxy asset transfer protocols. Nothing that would trigger alarm bells for anyone with basic legal knowledge." I picked up the document and began reading. The language was dense but clear, standard boilerplate about consideration and parties and jurisdiction. By page 3, I understood why someone reading quickly, someone eager, someone greedy might skim past the details. "Page 4, Desmond said. Clause 7, Section 3. I turned to it, read it twice. The clause was written in the same dense legal syntax as everything else. It didn't stand out, didn't announce itself. But once you understood what it said, it changed everything. Asset transfer would only take effect if the transferor, me, passed away from natural causes, verified by 2 independent medical examiners selected by the court. Any other circumstance, accidental death, homicide, suspicious circumstances of any kind, would trigger an immediate reversion of the entire estate to the Eleanor Foundation, a charitable trust, established that morning in Helena's name. This clause is entirely valid under the Massachusetts Uniform Trust Code, Desmond said. Completely legal, completely enforceable, and wrapped in enough legal syntax that most people won't parse it carefully unless they hire independent counsel to review every line. Will they hire counsel? I asked. Desmond smiled without humor. They will sign it out of sheer greed. Greedy people do not hire independent counsel to read the text before signing. They see what they want to see, a path to ownership, and they take it without looking for the trapdoor beneath their feet. I set the document down. The foundation will bear Helena's name, no matter what happens. That was the one thing I knew for certain. The Eleanor Foundation. Desmond confirmed. Endowed with the full value of the Golden Crust assets. Dedicated to culinary education scholarships for underprivileged students. Your wife's legacy secured in perpetuity. I signed the document. Desmond witnessed it. We sat in silence for a moment. They'll try to kill you, he said quietly. You understand that, don't you? Once they have this signed, once they believe they're in position, they'll move to the next step. I'm counting on it, I said. I drove from Salem to Gloucester, thinking about Helena. She used to say that the best recipes have a secret ingredient no one else can see. The Eleanor Foundation was mine. Monday afternoon, I met Eugene at Gloucester Police Headquarters. The building was old brick and institutional fluorescent lighting. We were led to a private interrogation room on the second floor, windowless soundproof door locked behind us. Inspector Stanley Whitfield was 58 and built like the oak desk he leaned against. He'd spent 30 years with Massachusetts State Police before transferring to Gloucester, and his face had the weathered look of someone who'd seen too many families destroy themselves over money. He reviewed Grant Norwood's dossier in silence. The casino photographs, the debt agreement, the letter of intent to Meridian. When he finished, he set the folder down and looked at me. This provides more than enough probable cause to secure a wiretap and recording warrant for your residence, he said. Specifically the common areas, living room, kitchen, dining room. The bedrooms are strictly outside the scope of this warrant per Massachusetts law. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I understand, I said. The warrant will allow us to install audio and video surveillance in those common areas. Everything they say, everything they do in those spaces will be recorded, admissible in court. And how long to install? Eugene asked. 24 hours. We'll need you out of the house for approximately 3 hours. Can you arrange that? Keys. Yes, I said. Whitfield leaned forward. If they go further, actual physical harm, poisoning, anything like that, we need 3 elements simultaneously. Surveillance footage showing the act. Lawful recordings under warrant capturing their words. And law enforcement catching them red-handed at the scene. All 3, simultaneously. Otherwise, a defense attorney will tear apart the chain of custody and suppress everything. I met his eyes. Then all 3 elements simultaneously. He nodded slowly. The judge will sign the warrant this afternoon. We'll install tomorrow morning. After that, you'll be living in a documented crime scene. Everything you do, everything you say in those common areas will be recorded. You understand? I understand. Good. He stood. One more thing. They'll look for allies. Try to turn people close to you. Your employees, friends, anyone who might give them information or help them circumvent your defenses. Eugene spoke for the first time. They'll approach me. Whitfield looked at him. You're certain? I'm the logical target. Daily access to the shop trusted by Lawrence, no obvious loyalty that can't be bought. If I were planning this operation, I'd approach me first. And when they do, Eugene's face was calm. I'll say yes, take the money, play the role, and document every word. As we stepped out of the police headquarters, Eugene turned to me. The son-in-law will approach me soon. You're sure? It's the next logical move he has to make. He needs an insider. I looked at him. Are you ready? He smiled the smile of a man who had been ready far longer than I realized. Eugene's prediction sat in my mind as I drove home. Corbin would try to bribe him, try to turn my only ally into an informant or saboteur. The trap had legal architecture, now Desmond's document and Whitfield's warrant. But Eugene was about to become the human element, the piece that would make Corbin believe he was winning when he was actually tightening the noose around his own neck. The bribe would come within 48 hours. Eugene was right. Corbin approached him on Wednesday evening, exactly 41 hours after we walked out of the police headquarters. The audio file Eugene sent me began with the sound of a glass being set down on a wooden bar. Then Corbin's voice, smooth, casual manufactured surprise. Eugene, right from the bakery. I listened to it that night in my bedroom, with the door locked and the lights off. The file was 17 minutes and 32 seconds long. Eugene had recorded it on his phone. Under Massachusetts law, all parties to a conversation must consent to being recorded. But Eugene had covered himself the moment Corbin sat down, mentioning casually that he recorded all his business discussions as a professional habit, an old accountant's reflex. Corbin smiled and kept talking. Consent documented. Every word is admissible. The recording quality was surprisingly good. I could hear the ambient noise of the tavern, low conversation glasses, clinking, someone playing pool in the background. Eugene's voice when he responded, "That's right. Well, thought I recognized you." Corbin's voice moved closer, the audio suggesting he'd slid onto the bar stool beside Eugene. "I'm staying with my father-in-law right now. Small world." "Small town," Eugene corrected. A pause, then Corbin, "Can I buy you a drink?" "Sure." They made small talk for the first 4 minutes. Weather, Gloucester Harbor, the fishing industry. Corbin was good at it, the kind of conversational skill that comes from years of practice manipulating strangers into thinking they're friends. Eugene played along, his responses measured and neutral. Then at minute 6, Corbin shifted. "Eugene, I'm going to be direct with you because I think you're a practical man. I need some information about the bakery operations, recipes, suppliers, that sort of thing." "Why, business opportunity. My father-in-law is getting older, not thinking as clearly as he used to. I'm trying to help my wife understand what she'll be inheriting so she can manage it properly when the time comes." The lie was so smooth I almost believed it myself. Eugene didn't respond immediately. I could hear him take a drink, set the glass down. "What kind of information?" Corbin's voice dropped lower, more confidential. "The sourdough recipe, the proprietary one. I know it's patented. I need the documentation." "That's not mine to give." "I understand, which is why I'm prepared to make it worth your while. $50,000, cash." Silence on the recording, 5 seconds, 10. Corbin continued. "I'll also need a signed affidavit, health code violations, structural issues with the flagship location, whatever plays best. Nothing that would hold up to serious scrutiny, just enough to establish grounds for intervention if needed." "You're asking me to lie under oath." "I'm asking you to help a family in transition. My father-in-law is declining. My wife needs to take control before something catastrophic happens. $50,000, Eugene. That's more than you'd make in 2 years doing bookkeeping." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Eugene's breathing through the phone microphone. Then quietly, "Deal." The sound of hands shaking. Corbin's voice warming immediately. "Smart man. I'll have the cash next week. We'll meet somewhere private to handle the paperwork." The recording continued for another 6 minutes, logistics timing, Corbin reminding Eugene to keep their arrangement confidential. Then Eugene said he needed to get going, and the audio ended. I turned off my phone after listening to Eugene's recording, looked out my bedroom window at Gloucester Harbor in the darkness. Corbin had just handed us conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft of intellectual property, and bribery, all on a 17-minute audio file. Eugene was right, they always make it easy. He thought he just bought my only friend. He didn't know there was nothing in this house available for purchase. Friday morning, day 7. I began the next phase, breakfast. I sat at the kitchen table with Celine and Corbin, eating toast and drinking coffee. Halfway through, I coughed, not dramatic, not theatrical, just a small catch in my throat that made me reach for my water glass. Nothing alarming, just noticeable. Celine's eyes flickered to Corbin. Brief, but I saw it. Later that morning, I called my bakery manager. Corbin was in the living room, close enough to overhear. "Tell Marcus." I paused, frowned slightly. "No, wait, Michael. The one who opens on Tuesdays." The manager's confused voice came through the speaker. "You mean Marcus, sir? He's been with us for 3 years." "Right, Marcus, of course." I hung up and rubbed my temples as if I had a headache. In the afternoon, I settled into the living room armchair with a newspaper and my reading glasses. Corbin sat across from me with a book, some business biography he'd been carrying around all week without actually reading. I made it through 2 articles before I let my eyes drift closed, let my head tip back against the chair, let the newspaper slide from my lap onto the floor. I stayed that way for 20 minutes, eyes closed, breathing slow, and even glasses still perched on my nose. Through my eyelashes, I saw Corbin look up from his book, saw his eyes fix on me for a long moment. Then his gaze darted to Celine, who had just entered the room from the kitchen. The look that passed between them lasted less than a second, but the surveillance camera mounted near the ceiling, installed Tuesday morning, while I'd taken them on a carefully timed 3-hour tour of the coastal bakery locations, captured it in perfect high definition. That night, I sat in my bedroom and reviewed the footage on my phone. Corbin's eyes had moved to Celine, not with concern, not with worry about my health, with calculation. The look of a man adjusting his timeline. How much time do you give someone you think is declining? A week, a month, long enough to get comfortable, to stop watching over your shoulder, to believe you've already won. That's enough. They believe it. The cognitive decline narrative has been planted and they're already calculating how much time they have left. I closed the surveillance application and set my phone on the nightstand. Downstairs, the living room lights were still burning. I could see Corbin's shadow moving past the window, pacing probably on the phone. He thought he had an ally in Eugene and a dying old man in me. The 45-day clock on the Meridian letter of intent was ticking down, and I could feel his desperation beginning to sharpen into something more dangerous. The next morning, Desmond called with news that would reframe everything. The letter of intent wasn't just about the storefronts. Desmond's call came through at 3:15 p.m. on Friday, while I was reviewing inventory sheets in my office behind the bakery kitchen, and the first words out of his mouth made my hand stop mid-signature. The letter of intent. It's worse than we thought. I set down my pen. Explain. I had a colleague at a corporate firm run the Meridian contract through their database. The $18 million isn't just for the storefronts and the brand name. What else? The proprietary recipe patent. They want the 30-year sourdough formula. It's buried in Section 12, subsection D, intellectual property transfer, as condition of sale. Without that patent, the entire agreement is void. I sat very still. They don't want just the sign on the door, Desmond continued. They want your 30-year recipe, Helena's recipe. After that, the golden crust becomes nothing more than a label on an industrial assembly line. 12 states, 40 locations are made by machines instead of bakers. I looked out the window at the harbor. A fishing boat was coming and gulls circling overhead. How much time is left on the LOI? My voice was eerily calm. 40 days. I thanked Desmond and hung up. Sat there for 10 minutes staring at nothing. Then I picked up my phone and called Inspector Whitfield. Saturday morning, I met Whitfield at a private medical clinic, 40 minutes outside Gloucester. The building was closed for the weekend, just the three of us in an examination room with fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic. Dr. Thomas Merrick was the physician Whitfield trusted for sensitive cases. Mid-50s silver beard, the kind of precise, careful manner that comes from years of high-stakes medical decisions. He explained the feigned death protocol with the detached precision of a man who had supervised dozens of high-risk undercover operations and understood that clinical honesty was the only ethical approach when a 60-year-old man was volunteering to flatline his own heart, a peripheral nervous system inhibitor. He said, showing me a small vial of clear liquid. This will drop your heart rate from 60 beats per minute to 28 or 30 within 3 to 4 minutes. It mimics sudden cardiac arrest almost perfectly. Shallow breathing, minimal pulse loss of consciousness. And the antidote, intravenous, restores baseline cardiac function within 8 minutes. I'll be stationed in a vehicle 50 meters from your house with all necessary equipment. The moment Inspector Whitfield gives the signal, I move. What are the risks? I asked. Dr. Merrick looked at me directly. If you have an undetected underlying cardiac condition, arrhythmia, structural defect, anything. This is a lethal gamble. I need an ECG and an echocardiogram within 48 hours. If those tests show anything abnormal, we don't proceed. And if they're normal, then the risk drops to approximately 3%. Equipment failure, adverse reaction timing error. But if something goes wrong with your heart during the procedure, you die. That's the risk. I had the test done Monday morning. 2 days later, Dr. Merrick called with the results: completely healthy heart. Textbook cardiovascular function for a 60-year-old man. I signed the medical informed consent waiver with steady hands. I don't have a heart problem, I told him. I have a different problem that needs solving. I drove home from the medical clinic thinking about Helena. 30 years she spent perfecting that sourdough recipe temperature, humidity timing, the exact moment to fold the dough. They wanted to take that and turn it into something that could be made by machines and factories across 12 states. Not if I had breath left in my body. Monday morning, I came downstairs at 5 a.m. as usual. The poison flour container was already secured in an evidence bag. I'd swapped it 70 minutes after Celine returned to her room, handled it with medical gloves, documented the chain of custody before the sky turned gray. Inspector Whitfield's confirmation text had arrived within seconds. The warrant camera had captured everything in high definition. The evidence was locked. Now I needed them to believe nothing had changed. I brewed coffee, set the pristine flour container, identical brand, identical size, purchased 3 weeks ago for exactly this purpose, in its usual spot on the shelf. When Celine came downstairs at 7, the kitchen looked precisely as it always had. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes moving to the cabinet. Then she looked at me. "Good morning," I said. "Good morning, Dad." She poured herself coffee and sat at the table without another word. Her hands were steady. Whatever she'd felt standing in this kitchen at 3:47 a.m. had been packed away somewhere I couldn't see. I made toast. The flour I used was clean, safe, completely ordinary. She watched me eat. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Just lay in the darkness, counting down the minutes until it was time to move. At exactly 5 a.m. Monday morning, 70 minutes after watching my daughter pour poison into flour, I moved through the dark Victorian home kitchen in my socks, with medical gloves already on my hands. The house was completely silent. Upstairs, Celine and Corbin were asleep in the guest room, or pretending to sleep the way I'd been pretending. Either way, they weren't moving. I'd prepared the night before. Medical gloves in my robe pocket. An identical pristine flour container hidden in the back of the pantry behind the canned goods. Evidence bag with chain of custody label already filled out, sealed in a drawer. I opened the cabinet, pulled out the poison container, handled it with extreme care, no shaking, no tilting, nothing that would disturb the powder inside, set it on the counter, retrieved the evidence bag from the drawer, slid the container inside, sealed it. Wrote the time in permanent marker, 05:02 a.m., Monday, July 29, 2024. Then I went to the pantry and pulled out the pristine container. Identical brand, identical size. I'd bought it 3 weeks ago specifically for this purpose. The flour inside was clean, safe, completely ordinary. I positioned it in the exact spot on the shelf. Closed the cabinet. 4 minutes. That's all it took to secure the evidence of my daughter's attempt to murder me. I peeled off the medical gloves and dropped them into the evidence bag, sealed it again, carried the bag to the back door, and set it on the floor just out of sight behind the coat rack. Eugene would collect it at 6 a.m. when he arrived for our usual morning meeting. He had a contact at the FBI lab in Boston, someone who owed him a favor from his Navy days. The toxicology analysis would be completed by Wednesday. I brewed coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, watched the first thin cracks of dawn light break over Gloucester Harbor through the window. My phone vibrated against the table. Text from Eugene, FBI lab, Monday. I typed back one word, good. I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee in the 5:30 a.m. darkness, that evidence bag sitting behind the door, like a bomb with my daughter's fingerprints all over it. The little girl with flour on her face had tried to kill me with flour 30 years later. The symmetry wasn't poetic. It was just cruel. Tuesday morning at 9:30, the bakery was packed. The usual crowd, regulars picking up their daily bread, tourists wandering in from the harbor, local business people grabbing coffee before work. Every table was full. The line at the counter stretched to the door. I was behind the pastry display, helping a customer select croissants when the man walked in. Heavily built, sharp black coat despite the July heat, completely unsmiling expression, the kind of face that made conversations stop. He walked directly to the counter, didn't wait in line, just stood there until people moved aside. "I need to see the owner," he said. His voice was flat, professional. I stepped forward. "I'm the owner." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, formal, official looking, placed it on the counter. "I am an authorized representative of XYZ Capital Financial Corporation," he said. His voice carried across the entire bakery, loud enough that every conversation stopped, every head turned. "The outstanding balance of Corbin Harrington is $3.2 million. Payment is due in 3 weeks. Per the contract terms, you are listed as the asset guarantor. I am here to serve formal notice." The bakery had gone completely silent. He pulled a business card from his pocket, set it beside the envelope. "You have 3 weeks, he said. "After that, legal proceedings begin." Then he turned on his heel and walked out. The door closed behind him. The bell above it gave a cheerful little jingle that sounded obscene in the silence. I picked up the envelope, looked at it. My face showed nothing but confusion and concern, exactly what a man who just learned his son-in-law had massive gambling debts should show. Across the crowded bakery, at a corner table near the window, Corbin sat frozen. He'd brought Celine for coffee that morning. They'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, pretending to enjoy a normal Tuesday morning, probably congratulating themselves on how well their plan was proceeding. Now Corbin's face had turned completely white. I watched him lean towards Celine, whisper something frantic. His hands were gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles showed white. Celine looked down at her lap, didn't respond, just sat there staring at nothing. The bakery slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed. Someone laughed nervously. The line started moving again. I slipped the envelope and business card into my apron pocket and went back to serving customers. Grant Norwood, because that's who the debt collector had been, dressed in perfect disguise with makeup aging him 10 years, and a voice I barely recognized had just compressed Corbin's timeline down to 3 weeks. More importantly, he'd done it publicly, in front of 40 witnesses, establishing me as an unwitting asset guarantor, a victim of my son-in-law's financial crimes, an old man who didn't even know he'd been used as collateral. What does a desperate man with $3.2 million in gambling debt and 3 weeks to live do when his last remaining option is an old man who appears to be dying anyway? I stood behind the counter, my hands resting flat on the wood, calm, professional, like any other Tuesday morning. The clock was ticking, but not for me. Through the window, I could see the black sedan Grant had arrived in pulling away from the curb. 3 weeks. Corbin had 3 weeks before $3.2 million came due, and he was sitting 20 feet away from a man he thought was dying and worth $31 million. That evening, the living room surveillance would capture the conversation that would seal his fate. The evening surveillance captured everything, every word. The email from Inspector Whitfield arrived at 6:03 a.m. Wednesday morning with the subject line, Audio File Living Room, 11:04 p.m. Tuesday, and an attachment labeled Warrant Recording Confidential. I opened it in my kitchen while the coffee was still brewing. The attachment included both an audio file and a typed transcript. I read the transcript first. Timestamp, 23:04, 17 location. Victorian home, living room, participants. Corbin, Harrington. Solene, Harrington. The transcript began mid-conversation. Corbin's voice came through clear and unmistakable. Corbin, the collector means we're out of time. You understand that, right? 3 weeks, we can't wait any longer. Solene, I know. Corbin, then you have to do it now. Tonight, tomorrow morning, at the latest. Solene E. Corbin, he has a high blood pressure history. It will look like a standard heart attack, natural causes. The medical examiner won't even question it, given his age and the cognitive decline you've been documenting. A pause, 7 seconds according to the timestamp. Solene, but Corbin. No, but you've come too far. There's no turning back. You understand what happens? If we don't get that money, I go to prison. You lose everything. We lose everything. This is the only way forward. Another pause, 4 seconds. Solene, okay. Corbin, say it clearly. Solene, I'll do it tomorrow morning. Corbin, good. Use the kitchen cabinet, his personal flour. He uses it every morning for that bread he makes. It has to be tomorrow. The transcript ended there. Footsteps, door closing, silence. I read it twice. Then I picked up my phone and called Inspector Whitfield. You have this? I asked when he answered. Yes, warrant authorized recording, completely admissible. That's attempted murder the moment they take the final physical action. And they will. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. They were ordering her to do what she'd already done at 3:47 a.m. Monday morning. Corbin's command on Tuesday night came after the crime had been committed. I called Whitfield back 2 hours later. The flour she poisoned Monday, they're ordering her to do what she already did. He was quiet for a second, which means we have premeditation, conspiracy, and attempt. The Holy Trinity. I hung up and stared at the harbor. Before I tell you what my daughter discovered next on that laptop, are you still with me? Comment A if you think she'll choose her father, or B if she'll choose Corbin. Add one short reason why. Quick note, the next part includes some adapted details for storytelling impact. The lesson is what matters most. Wednesday afternoon, at 2:30, Corbin left the house to meet with someone. Probably Eugene, probably to finalize their fraudulent deal about the recipe patent and the false health code affidavit. He'd been gone for 20 minutes when it happened. I was at the bakery sitting in my office behind the kitchen when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the living room camera. I opened the surveillance application. Solene stood in the living room. Corbin's laptop sat open on the coffee table where he'd left it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she sat down on the sofa and pulled it toward her. I watched from miles away as she navigated through folders. Her fingers moved with the kind of certainty that suggested she knew what she was looking for. She found a directory labeled Legal Documents, opened it, scrolled through the files. Then she stopped, double-clicked on something. A document opened. Even through the grainy camera feed, I could see enough to know what it was. The header, Power of Attorney Full Asset Transfer. And at the bottom of the first page, a signature in blue ink. Her signature. She stared at it. Her face went completely still. I knew that paper. 6 months ago, Corbin had told her she needed to sign it for a joint savings account they were opening together. A formality, he'd said. Just a banking requirement. But it wasn't a banking requirement. It was a legal document granting him complete and irrevocable control over any assets she inherited from any source. The moment I died, and she became heir to the Golden Crust, everything would automatically transfer to Corbin's control. She'd get nothing. He'd get it all. She'd signed away her entire inheritance 6 months ago without realizing it. Now she was reading the document and understanding what it meant. She closed the laptop with surgical slowness, set it back exactly where it had been. Then she sat on the sofa perfectly still, staring at the wall. 3 minutes, I timed it. My hand hovered over my phone. I could call her. I could send a text. I could give her one last chance to choose differently. She could stop right now, walk into the kitchen, call the police, tell the truth, confess what she'd done Monday morning at 3:47, turn state's evidence against Corbin, save herself. I don't know what I would have done if she had chosen that path. But she didn't. At 2:34 p.m. she stood up, smoothed her shirt, checked her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. Then she walked upstairs as if nothing had happened. The choice was made. At what point does choosing to stay silent become the same thing as choosing to kill? I watched my daughter walk upstairs at 2:34 p.m., knowing what her husband had done to her, and I understood the answer right then. That moment. I closed the surveillance application and sat in my bakery office staring at the wood grain of my desk. My daughter had just discovered her husband's ultimate betrayal and chosen to remain complicit in murdering me anyway. Whatever moral thread had been holding her to her mother's memory, to the little girl with flour on her face, had finally snapped. The question wasn't whether she would go through with it anymore. The question was how much of her was left to save. That night, Eugene and I would meet at the harbor pier for the final briefing before the endgame. That night I met Eugene at the pier as planned. The ocean wind cut across Gloucester Harbor Pier at 10 o'clock Thursday night, and Eugene's words hung in the salt air between us. We have enough evidence. Whitfield can execute the arrest warrant tonight. We stood at the end of the pier beyond the range of the streetlights. The harbor stretched out dark and vast before us, blinking lights from boats moored offshore, the distant echo of a foghorn somewhere out in the bay. The wood beneath our feet was damp from earlier rain. The recording, Eugene continued. The poison flower in the FBI lab, Corbin's bribery attempt with me, the power of attorney fraud, the corporate letter of intent. It's enough to put them both away for 20 years. I looked out at the black water. Not yet, I said. Eugene turned to look at me. I need him to tear off his mask completely in front of my daughter, I said. I need her to see exactly who he is before the curtain drops. Not through evidence, not through testimony. I need her to witness it with her own eyes. That's dangerous, Eugene said quietly. The feigned cardiac arrest, Dr. Merrick's protocol. If something goes wrong, I know the risks. Do you... I turned to face him. I'm 60 years old. My wife is dead. My daughter tried to poison me. What exactly am I protecting by playing it safe? The wind howled between us. Eugene was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a question I wasn't expecting. What would she want if she knew about this? I didn't need to ask who he meant. Helena? Yes. I stared at the horizon where the dark water met the darker sky. She would tell me I'm doing the right thing, I said. Eugene nodded slowly. I believe she would. The way he said it, quiet, certain, like a man speaking from knowledge rather than assumption, made me turn and look at him closely. You say that like a man who actually knew her. The wind filled the silence between us. For the first time in 5 years of friendship, Eugene had no immediate answer. He just stood there looking out at the water, his weathered face unreadable in the darkness. Then he said, we should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. We stood on that pier a while longer, in the comfortable silence of two men who had grown accustomed to being silent together. Then Eugene spoke, I'll arrive early tomorrow. What time? Before they wake up. I nodded. We didn't need to say anything else. Friday morning at breakfast, the atmosphere at the Victorian home's dining table was outwardly normal. Solene had made scrambled eggs and toast. Corbin sat reading something on his phone. I drank coffee and looked out the window at the harbor, watching the morning fishing boats head out. Can I ask you something? Corbin said. His voice was casual, too casual, the kind of manufactured casualness that comes from rehearsing a question until it sounds unrehearsed. I looked at him. Of course. Who handles your legal paperwork? Estate planning, that sort of thing. I took a sip of coffee. Let the question sit for a moment. Desmond Prescott, I said. He's worked with me for 15 years, handles everything. Estate planning, trust transfers, all the complex financial structures for the business. Local attorney at Salem, he has an office on Washington Street. Smart man, very thorough. Corbin nodded, his expression politely interested. That must be helpful, having someone who knows all the details. Essential, I said. If I'm ever unable to manage the business, cognitive decline, medical emergency, whatever, he's the only man who knows where every dollar is. The whole operation would grind to a halt without his documentation. Yet I stood up from the table, picked up my plate, just in case you kids ever need to contact him for anything. I said, pulling one of Desmond's business cards from my wallet and setting it flat on the table. He's a good resource. Corbin's eyes locked onto the card. I walked into the kitchen carrying my plate, my back to them. I had loaded the final round into the chamber. All that was left was to wait for him to pull the trigger himself. I set my plate in the sink and turned on the water. Through the doorway, I could see Corbin pick up the business card, study it, slip it into his shirt pocket. Solene was staring at her eggs, not eating. A baker learns to recognize the exact moment when dough is ready, when every element has been properly measured, mixed, and allowed to rise at precisely the right temperature. Watching Corbin stare at that business card, I thought, this is that moment. I brewed a second cup of coffee. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water running and the distant cry of gulls outside. Then I heard it, the scrape of a chair behind me, Corbin standing up from the breakfast table, fast footsteps heading toward the back door, the click of the door closing as he stepped outside. I turned off the water and walked to the kitchen window. Corbin was on the back lawn phone, pressed to his ear, pacing, his free hand gesturing as he talked. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. I watched the entire thing. When he came back inside, his face was calm, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like excitement. Everything okay? I asked. Fine, he said. Just needed to take a work call. On a Friday morning? He smiled. Client emergency. You know how it is. I nodded, went back to my coffee. That afternoon I received a text from Desmond. One line, Corbin Harrington just called my office asking about expedited estate transfer procedures. Wants to meet Monday. I typed back, perfect. I stood at the sink holding my coffee mug, watching through the window as Corbin had paced the back lawn with his phone pressed to his ear. Today would be the last day anything remained normal in this house. That evening, everything would accelerate toward the point of no return. That evening arrived faster than I expected. The wine Celine poured that Friday evening was the color of old blood, and I knew before the glass touched my lips that my daughter had finally committed herself to murder. 7:45 p.m. I sat in my study behind the kitchen, reviewing paperwork from the bakery. The house was quiet. Corbin had gone upstairs an hour ago, claiming he needed to make some work calls. His absence was calculated plausible deniability, I assumed. When this went to trial, he'd claim he wasn't even in the room. Solene appeared in the doorway holding a wine glass. I thought you might want this, she said. Her voice was soft, almost tender. She crossed the room and set the glass on my desk. Red wine. Dark red, nearly purple in the lamplight. 3 hours earlier, I'd taken the clinical absorption inhibitor Dr. Merrick had provided, a small white pill dissolved in water. It tasted like nothing, but it would prevent whatever toxin she'd put in this wine from metabolizing in my system. I thank you, I said. I picked up the glass. Her hands were trembling slightly as she stood there watching me. I drank. The wine tasted of blackberries and something faintly bitter beneath barely perceptible, the kind of note that wouldn't register unless you were looking for it. My wife Helena had loved Merlot. For a moment, I wasn't a 60-year-old man being poisoned by his daughter. I was 35, again sitting on our back porch in summer twilight, watching Helena laugh at something our toddler Celine had said. The memory lasted 3 seconds. Then I was back in my study. Celine's hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the desk where my assets waited to be stolen. I waited 5 minutes. Then I began the performance. Lethargy first. Let my shoulders slump slightly. Blinked slowly. Let my eyes lose focus. Dad, Celine's voice sharpened. Are you okay? And I mumbled something incoherent. Reached for the desk to steady myself. Her expression shifted. The anxiety drained from her face, replaced by something colder, harder. Determination. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a folded document, unfolded it on the desk in front of me. Dad, I need you to sign this, she said. Her voice was steady now. It's just paperwork, for the bakery. Just press your thumb here, then you can rest. She guided my hand to the signature pad. I let her position my thumb. Applied pressure. The digital signature captured. Soline's shoulders dropped. She exhaled a long, relieved breath. "Good," she whispered. "That's good." I mumbled again. "Tired. Going to bed." I stood up slowly, swaying slightly, shuffled toward the door, up the stairs, into my bedroom. I locked the door behind me. Then I moved quickly, took out my phone, photographed the empty wine glass I'd brought with me, photographed the label, sent both images to Desmond with a timestamp. His response came in seconds. Signature obtained under chemical duress, voidable. Document the next 24 hours meticulously. I set my phone on the nightstand and lay down on top of the covers, fully dressed. I didn't sleep. Saturday morning, at 7:15, I went downstairs. Solene and Corbin sat at the kitchen table with coffee cups in front of them. Neither was drinking. The silence in that kitchen was absolute, oppressive. No one spoke. I moved to the counter, pulled out bread. The pristine flour I'd used to make it the container I'd swapped to the front of the pantry. Safe, clean, completely ordinary. I made toast, buttered it slowly, methodically, sat down at the table. Corbin's eyes never left my hands. He watched me take each bite with a focus that was almost predatory, calculating, waiting. Solene stared at her coffee cup. She hadn't touched it. The only sounds were my chewing the kitchen clock ticking on the wall, and somewhere outside the window, a gull crying over the harbor. I ate 3 slices of toast over 30 minutes. Then I set down the third slice half-eaten and looked at Corbin. "Not feeling well," I said quietly. "Going to lie down in the living room." I stood up, put one hand on the table for balance. Not dramatic, just enough unsteadiness to be believable. Corbin's spine straightened. I walked slowly to the living room, lowered myself onto the leather sofa, lay back, closed my eyes. Through my lashes I watched. Corbin's chair scraped back, too loud in the silence. His footsteps crossed the kitchen. Fast. Too fast for someone who wasn't expecting anything. I heard him move into the hallway, the muffled sound of phone buttons being pressed. Then his voice, urgent but controlled. "It's happening, he just..." A pause. "How long should we wait before calling?" Another pause. Longer. "Understood." I lay perfectly still. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every muscle tensed. But I kept my breathing slow and even, my face relaxed. The trap I'd set for 19 days was finally springing closed around my daughter and her husband. Through the living room window, I watched the neighbors' grandchildren playing in their yard, across the street. A boy about 7, a girl, maybe 5. The girl was showing the boy how to blow dandelion seeds. They were laughing. Their grandmother sat on the porch steps smiling. A normal Saturday morning in Gloucester Harbor, where families loved each other, and old men were safe. I heard Corbin's footsteps return to the kitchen, heard him sit down. Low voices, Solene and Corbin talking, too quiet for me to make out words. I lay on that sofa with my eyes closed, listening to them coordinate my murder in whispers, and thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. Mine, theirs, Helena's. Everything had converged here, in this living room, on this Saturday morning. I waited. 15 minutes passed. 20. Then I heard Solene's footsteps approaching. She stopped in the doorway of the living room. Her voice was soft, almost concerned. I didn't respond, kept my breathing slow and even. She walked closer. I could feel her standing over me looking down. Then she turned and walked back to the kitchen. More whispered conversation. I lay motionless on the sofa, eyes closed, listening to Corbin's urgent phone call still echoing in my mind. The poisoning plan was in motion. They believed I was dying, and I had to maintain this performance until the very last moment. 25 minutes after lying down on that sofa, I decided it was time. I stood from the sofa at exactly 8 o'clock, took 3 steps toward the kitchen, and let my heart stop. Not literally. Dr. Merrick's peripheral nervous system inhibitor wouldn't take effect for another 3 to 4 minutes. But I'd practiced this collapse for a week in my bedroom at 3 a.m., perfecting every movement, every fall, every muscle spasm that would make it look real. I halted mid-room, clutched my chest with both hands. My face contorted pain, genuine fear, the expression of a man whose heart has just betrayed him. Then I crashed forward onto the hardwood floor. The impact was harder than I'd anticipated. My shoulder hit first, then my hip. Pain shot through my side, but I channeled it into the performance. Let my body convulse. Controlled spasms that looked uncontrolled. Eyes rolling back. Breathing becoming shallow, erratic. A 60-year-old man having a cardiac arrest. From the kitchen doorway, Solene screamed. "Bestättest." I heard her footsteps, but they stopped, didn't come closer. Then Corbin's footsteps, rapid across the tile, moving toward me. But they didn't approach my body. They moved past the living room, toward the hallway, toward the telephone. I lay on the floor, eyes half closed, watching through my lashes. Corbin grabbed the phone from the hallway table. His hands were shaking not from fear, from excitement. The kind of adrenaline that comes when a long-planned operation finally executes. He didn't dial 911. He dialed a different number, one he had memorized. I counted the buttons. 7 digits. A local call. The phone rang on speaker. Once, twice. Prescott Law. Desmond's voice came through clear and professional. Desmond, you need to come immediately. He just collapsed. A pause on the other end. I understand, Desmond said. His voice was calm, measured. Where? The house, Victorian home, Gloucester Harbor. You know the address. Is he conscious? No, I think he's dying. You need to activate the paperwork. Now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The call ended. Corbin stood in the hallway for a moment, phone still in his hand. Then he turned back toward the living room and looked at Celine. It's done, he said. 2 words, flat final. Celine was standing in the kitchen doorway, one hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide, fixed on my body. She didn't move. Celine, Corbin said sharply. It's done. Do you understand? She nodded, but she didn't look at him, just kept staring at me. The hardwood was cold against my cheek, and I could smell the lemon oil Celine had used to polish this floor 3 days ago, back when she still pretended to care if I lived or died. I focused on my breathing. Shallow. So shallow it was barely perceptible. Dr. Merrick had taught me the technique. Small sips of air through barely parted lips. Enough to keep consciousness, not enough to look alive. My heart rate was dropping. I could feel it. The inhibitor was working. 60 beats per minute, 50, 40. The room started to swim slightly, edges blurring. I held on to consciousness through sheer will. Celine finally moved. She walked slowly into the living room and knelt beside me. Her knees hit the floor with a soft thud. She didn't touch me, just knelt there staring at my face. Her breathing was shaky, irregular. Not the breathing of someone who had won. The breathing of someone on the edge of panic. She whispered. Should we call someone? Corbin turned to look at her. His expression was cold. No, he said. Desmond is coming. That's enough. But he's 60 years old with high blood pressure and cognitive decline. This was always going to happen. Desmond will handle the paperwork. Then we'll call 911. It will look exactly like what it is, an old man whose heart gave out. Celine's hands were trembling. I could see them from the corner of my eye, shaking in her lap. Corbin walked back into the living room, stood over me, looking down. He nudged my shoulder with his foot. Not hard, just testing. I didn't react. He crouched down, put 2 fingers against my neck, checking for a pulse. My heart rate was down to 30 beats per minute, barely perceptible, exactly as Dr. Merrick had predicted. Corbin pulled his hand back. He's almost gone, he said quietly. Celine made a sound something between a gasp and a sob. Corbin stood up, checked his watch. 19 minutes, he said. Desmond will be here in 19 minutes. Then this is over. He walked to the window, looked out at the street, waiting. Celine stayed kneeling beside me. I could hear her breathing, fast, shallow. The breathing of someone who was falling apart. Lying there on my living room floor, I understood finally what bait feels like in a trap, still patient, waiting for the jaws to close around the predator instead. Every word they had spoken was being recorded by the surveillance cameras mounted in the ceiling corners. Every second was documented. Corbin had called the lawyer instead of emergency services. He'd waited, checked my pulse, declared me almost dead. And he'd done it all on camera. 17 minutes now. 17 minutes separated me from Stanley Whitfield's reversal injection. 17 minutes to maintain shallow breathing, to keep my heart rate imperceptible, to lie motionless on this cold floor, while my daughter knelt beside me with trembling hands and my son-in-law stood by the window, reviewing his victory. Every second recorded, every word evidence. The longest 17 minutes of my life were about to begin. The front door opened at 8:22 a.m. Corbin spun toward the sound. Who the hell? Good morning. Desmond's courtroom voice filled the foyer. Mr. Harrington, Detective Hayes is here. I opened my eyes, fully placed both palms on Helena's carefully chosen hardwood floor, and sat up. The look on Corbin's face almost made 3 weeks of planning worthwhile. I stood slowly brushing dust from my cardigan and trousers. Eugene appeared behind Desmond, followed by Detective Raymond Hayes, Massachusetts State Police, mid-50s, 28 years, investigating financial crimes and elder abuse. Behind them, 3 uniformed officers. Lawrence Harrington. I extended my hand to Detective Hayes. Thank you for coming. Corbin found his voice first. This is absurd. We were about to call 911. My father-in-law collapsed. At 8:07 a.m., Detective Hayes said, pulling a tablet from his jacket. 15 minutes ago. Yet neither of you initiated emergency services. The 911 dispatch center has no record of calls from this address. He turned the tablet toward them. We do, however, have warrant-authorized footage from the camera system installed in your kitchen. This clip shows Ms. Harrington at 3:47 a.m. this past Monday, removing a substance from her pocket and adding it to a flour canister. Soline's face went white. The detective swiped to another screen. We also have warrant-authorized audio recordings capturing your conversation in this living room at 11:04 p.m. Tuesday evening, including specific instructions regarding timing, method, and asset transfer. Then Corbin did something I hadn't anticipated. He turned to Soline, not to the detective, not to me, to her. You signed the power of attorney in November 2022. He said, his voice dropping to something flat and final. Everything you inherit from your father transfers through those accounts I control entirely. You did your job. The bakery was always mine. Soline stared at him. You were useful, he said. That's all. I watched my daughter's face in the moment she understood completely, not just what Corbin had done to me, but what he had done to her. The marriage, the years, the plan she thought they'd built together. She didn't cry. She just looked at him the way you look at something you finally see clearly for the first time. Soline Marie Harrington Corbin, Alexander Harrington. You're both under arrest for attempted murder, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. Detective Hayes gestured to the uniformed officers. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda warnings continued as handcuffs clicked into place. Corbin stood rigid, his jaw set. Soline's eyes found mine, once not searching for rescue, just acknowledgement. As the officers led them towards separate patrol cars, my daughter turned back once. Not to me, but to the living room floor where I had lain pretending to die. Her expression wasn't anger or grief. It was recognition. My daughter asked me the question in handcuffs 30 seconds before the officers would take her away forever. Did you love me, Dad? The patrol cars idled in the circular driveway, their engines a low rumble beneath the August morning heat. Detective Hayes stood 3 feet behind Soline on the Victorian home's front porch, giving her this final moment before the transport. Through the doorway, I could see Corbin already seated in the second vehicle, his profile rigid behind tinted glass. Soline's hands were cuffed in front of her body, a small mercy Hayes had granted when she'd asked to speak to me. Her hair had come loose from its usual neat arrangement. She looked younger than 32, closer to the girl who had left for college 14 years ago, with Helena's pearl earrings and a promise to call every Sunday. I did. My voice came out steadier than I'd expected. I loved you from the second you were born, and I will love you until I close my eyes forever. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, recognition maybe, acknowledgement. But love doesn't mean shielding you from the consequences of what you did in that kitchen. She nodded once barely. The movement was so slight I might have imagined it. Then she turned toward Detective Hayes, and the moment ended. The officer on her left, a young woman with blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, placed a hand on Soline's elbow. They descended the porch steps together, crossing the 20 feet of cobblestone pathway Helena had insisted on installing back in 2008 because she'd loved the sound of footsteps on stone. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter walk away from the home where she'd grown up, where Helena had read her bedtime stories and taught her to measure flour for pie crust, and explained that loving someone meant seeing them clearly, not through the filter of what you wish they were. The patrol car door closed with a specific sound rubber seal against metal frame, and through the window, I watched my daughter's profile disappear behind tinted glass, the way Helena's face had disappeared behind the hospice curtain 10 years ago. Desmond appeared beside me. The arraignment will likely be Monday morning. I've already contacted the defense attorney Soline requested. He paused. You should sit down, Lawrence. I'm fine. You just watched your daughter get arrested for attempting to murder you. You're not fine. He was right, of course. But standing required less energy than explaining why sitting felt impossible. The patrol cars pulled away at 8:43 a.m., disappearing down Harbor View Drive toward Route 128. Stanley left, shortly after promising to call later. Desmond stayed long enough to review the timeline for formal testimony, then departed with his leather briefcase and a reminder to eat something. By 8:50 a.m., only Eugene remained. He'd been waiting in the kitchen the entire time, giving me space to process the arrest without feeling observed. I found him at Helena's farmhouse table, 2 cups of coffee already poured, steam rising in the bright morning light, streaming through the bay window. Sit. Eugene pushed 1 cup toward the chair across from him. Doctor's orders. Well, accountant's orders, but Stanley would agree. I sat. We drank coffee in silence for nearly a minute. The kitchen clock ticked above the stove. Outside, a boat horn sounded from the harbor, 3 short blasts, the signal for a vessel leaving dock. Eugene reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small photograph, aged and creased at the corners. He placed it on the table between our coffee cups. 2 children stood at the ocean's edge. A girl, maybe 12 years old, with dark hair whipping in wind. Beside her, a teenage boy 15 or 16, with his arm around her shoulders. The photograph was black and white, faded to sepia tones, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The girl was Helena. This is Helena at 12. Eugene's finger touched the girl's face gently, the gesture of someone who'd held this photograph many times. And this is me. I looked from the photograph to the man across the table. Eugene Caldwell, 63 years old, who'd appeared in my life in April 2019 with impeccable references and a gift for finding patterns in financial statements. Eugene, who'd spent 5 years managing my accounts, catching errors, preventing disasters. Eugene, who had apparently been family the entire time. You're Helena's brother. Older brother by 3 years. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I was deployed Navy when she married you in 1986. Missed the wedding. Missed a lot of years, actually. Career took me to places where mail arrived monthly if I was lucky. The kitchen clock ticked. The boat horn sounded again farther away now. When she died in 2014, I took emergency leave. My flight arrived late, landed at Logan at 9 p.m., drove straight to Gloucester. Eugene's eyes stayed on the photograph. I found you at 11 p.m. sitting outside that closed storefront on Main Street in the rain. You were just sitting there, so I sat down beside you. I remembered that night. The worst night, the one 3 days after Helena's funeral, when the visitors had stopped coming and the house felt too empty to enter. I'd driven to the original Golden Crust location, closed for renovation, and sat on the bench out front, letting rain soak through my coat. Someone had sat beside me, a stranger. We'd sat together for maybe 20 minutes without speaking, then he'd stood up and walked away. That was you. That was me. Eugene met my eyes. I didn't tell you who I was that night, and when you hired me 5 years later, I didn't tell you then either. Why? The question hung between us. Eugene was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. You needed a friend, not an in-law. I believed that's what she would have wanted me to be. I'd spent 5 years believing I was alone in the world after Helena died, and all that time her brother had been sitting across from me at coffee shops and diner booths, protecting me without ever asking for recognition. She never told me she had a brother. We were complicated. Eugene's smile was sad. I wasn't around much, but she was my sister. And when I sat beside you that night in the rain, I understood exactly what she'd loved about you. I looked at the photograph of 12-year-old Helena standing at the ocean with her teenage brother, then at the 63-year-old man across my kitchen table, who'd spent 5 years pretending to be a stranger. And I understood finally why Helena had loved so fiercely. It was in her blood. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with 2 documents that would determine whether my daughter emerged from prison into freedom or into financial ruin. Eugene had left at dusk, taking the photograph of young Helena with him, but leaving behind something heavier, the knowledge that I'd never been as alone as I'd believed. The house felt different now. Quieter, maybe. Or perhaps I was simply hearing the silence differently. It was nearly 11 p.m. when I finally turned on the desk lamp in Helena's office and retrieved the papers Desmond had left that morning. They felt like artifacts from another lifetime, though less than 15 hours had passed since Detective Hayes had read Miranda rights in my living room. The first document was 12 pages. Inheritance revocation and estate restructure, drafted in Desmond's precise legal language. It would remove Celine from my will, entirely redirect assets to a charitable trust, and ensure that neither she nor Corbin could ever claim any portion of the Golden Crust legacy. Desmond had marked the signature lines with small yellow tabs. The second document was thinner, just 3 pages stapled together. Grant Norwood's final report, delivered 6 days ago, but set aside during the chaos of the trap's execution. It contained a single relevant section, Corbin's outstanding debts. $3.2 million owed to XYZ Capital Management, a private equity firm in Boston. The debt was legally Corbin's incurred before the marriage, but Celine had co-signed in November 2022 as part of what Corbin had presented as investment opportunity restructuring. She'd signed her name to his debt without understanding what she was signing. Or perhaps she had understood and simply believed they'd be rich enough soon that it wouldn't matter. When she left prison and eventually she would leave, whether in 5 years or 15, that debt would still exist. XYZ Capital didn't forget. The interest alone would have grown the balance to nearly $5 million by the time she was released. She would emerge into a different kind of prison. One with compound interest and collection agencies and wage garnishment for the rest of her life. I sat with both documents spread on Helena's farmhouse table, the desk lamp casting long shadows across the pages. The house was completely silent. No boat horns from the harbor, no distant traffic. Just the kitchen clock ticking and the sound of my own breathing. $3.2 million, the exact price apparently of my daughter's soul, itemized across 17 months of credit statements and equity draws that Corbin had orchestrated with the precision of a man who'd planned betrayal from their wedding day. I could let her face it alone, sign the inheritance revocation, let her serve her sentence, and allow XYZ Capital's collection machinery to grind her into dust afterward, just as clean and complete. Or I could do something Helena would have called foolish and Eugene would probably call compassionate. I picked up my phone and dialed Desmond's cell. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the late hour. Lawrence, are you all right? I need you to clear the account. The words came out steady, though I wasn't certain where they'd come from. Civil settlement anonymous through your firm, $3.2 million. Silence on the other end, then the XYZ Capital debt. Yes, you want to pay Celine's debt. I want to pay Corbin's debt, which my daughter was manipulated into co-signing. I looked at the inheritance revocation document, Desmond's yellow tabs bright in the lamplight. Anonymous settlement, no admission of liability. The payment comes through your firm's client trust account with no identifying information. XYZ Capital gets their money, the debt is marked satisfied, and Celine never knows who cleared it. Another pause. When Desmond spoke again, his voice was quieter. Are you certain? No. The honesty surprised me, but prepare the paperwork anyway. I'll have it ready by Monday morning. He hesitated. For what it's worth, Lawrence, I think Helena would have made the same choice. I ended the call and set the phone down on the table. The documents sat in their pool of lamplight waiting. The inheritance revocation would be signed. Celine would receive nothing from my estate, but she also wouldn't spend the rest of her life paying for Corbin's debts. Justice but not cruelty. Consequences but not destruction. I stood and walked to the far wall where Helena's apron still hung on its brass hook. The fabric was soft from years of washing, faded to a pale blue that barely showed the small strawberry pattern she'd loved. I tied it around my waist. It fit differently now than it had when she was alive to tie it for me and move to the counter. The dough I'd prepared that morning was still in the refrigerator, covered in plastic wrap, cold-proofed and waiting. I pulled it out and turned off the desk lamp, letting the kitchen fall into darkness. In the dark I began to knead. The dough was cold under my palms, and in the darkness I couldn't see what I was making, only felt the familiar resistance and yield the way Helena had taught me 40 years ago, when we'd baked our first loaf together in a kitchen half this size. Push forward with the heels of both hands. Fold. Quarter turn. Push. Fold. Turn. My hands knew this rhythm better than my mind knew most thoughts. I'd made the decision to clear the debt before I'd consciously understood I was making it. Not through rational deliberation or moral calculation, but through this the body's muscle memory of love, encoded in the motion of kneading dough at midnight in a dark kitchen. Helena used to say that baking was about faith. You mixed ingredients you couldn't see, transform into something you couldn't yet imagine, and you trusted the process because generations before you had trusted it too. Push, fold, turn. I kneaded bread in the dark for an hour while the documents sat untouched on the table behind me. When I finally stopped my hands aching, I understood what Helena would have wanted: justice that didn't require cruelty consequences, that didn't demand destruction. The inheritance would be revoked, the debt would be cleared, and my daughter would never know which hand had offered mercy. At 6:30 the next morning, I stood at the Gloucester Police Station visitor desk, with a pine wood pastry box that contained the last words I would ever speak to my daughter. The box was light in my hands, lighter than I'd expected. I'd made it myself 3 years ago, in the workshop behind the Victorian home, cut and sanded the pine boards to specifications Helena had sketched on graph paper. Golden Crust logo branded into the lid with a custom iron. We'd use these boxes for VIP deliveries, corporate gifts, the kind of occasions where presentation mattered as much as the product inside. This would be the final one. The officer at the visitor desk was young, maybe 30, with tired eyes that suggested the night shift was almost over. His nameplate read, Sullivan. Officer Michael Sullivan, 15 years with Gloucester PD, according to the commendation plaques on the wall behind him, processing visitor deliveries at the holding cell desk, with the efficient indifference of someone who'd seen every variety of human drama condensed into packages and envelopes. For Celine Harrington. I placed the box on the counter between us. Holding cell 3. Sullivan examined the box without touching it, his eyes moving from the logo to my face and back. Contents. Bread and documents. I'll need to inspect. Of course. He opened the lid carefully. Inside, wrapped in parchment paper still faintly warm, was a single sourdough loaf, the same recipe I'd taught Celine when she was 14, before she'd decided that baking was beneath her aspirations. Beneath the bread, 2 documents. Sullivan lifted them out, scanned the first page of each. Inheritance paperwork, he said, not a question, and a settlement receipt. The inheritance revocation was 12 pages signed and notarized the previous afternoon. Every clause precise, every contingency covered. Celine Marie Harrington removed entirely from the estate structure of Lawrence Edmund Harrington, effective immediately and irrevocably. The second document was shorter. Civil settlement receipt from Prescott Law Firm to XYZ Capital Management. Amount $3,200,000. Settlement of debt obligation for account XYZ 2022-1847. No admission of liability. No identifying information regarding the paying party. Just a reference number and Desmond's firm letterhead. At the bottom of the settlement receipt, I'd written 4 sentences in my own hand. I paid this so you can live. Consider it the final transaction of our shared blood. From this day forward, we are strangers. But you will live. Sullivan read the note without expression, then carefully returned both documents to the box beneath the bread. He closed the lid and made a note on his clipboard. I'll make sure she gets it. Thank you. The bread was still warm when I handed the box to Officer Sullivan. I had pulled it from the oven at 5:15 that morning, the way Helena and I used to do on Saturdays before the sun rose when the kitchen was dark and quiet and belonged only to us. The warmth would fade by the time Celine opened it. Maybe that was appropriate. Everything warm between us had been fading for years. I turned and walked out of the station into morning sunlight without waiting to see what happened when the box reached holding cell 3. Whatever expression crossed my daughter's face when she lifted that lid and understood what I'd given her, justice and mercy in equal measure, estrangement and survival wrapped in parchment paper, I didn't need to witness it. Some endings don't require an audience. 3 weeks later, I sat in Desmond's office in Salem while he delivered the final legal summary. The mahogany desk between us was covered in manila folders, each one representing a different aspect of the case that had consumed August 2024. Desmond worked through them methodically, his courtroom voice steady and precise. Corbin Harrington remanded without bail. Charges include attempted murder, elder financial abuse, bribery of corporate officers, and conspiracy to commit murder. The DA is seeking 20 to 30 years. His attorney is already discussing plea arrangements. I nodded but said nothing. The corporate letter of intent is null and void. Corbin possessed 0 lawful ownership stake in Golden Crust assets. Meridian Capital withdrew their offer with no litigation. They want no association with the scandal. Desmond flipped to another folder. Celine Harrington charged with complicity in attempted murder and administering harmful substance. Facing 5 to 8 years, likely reduced for cooperation with the district attorney's investigation into Corbin's financial crimes. And the business, Desmond looked up from his papers. The Golden Crust, all assets, brand value, patents, real estate holdings, completely untouched. No active claims, no liens, no disputed ownership. He paused. You won Lawrence. Completely. The empire is secured. The September afternoon sun came through the office windows, at an angle that made the dust motes visible, suspended in golden light. Outside, Salem Harbor was busy with afternoon boat traffic, life continuing as it always had, indifferent to the small human dramas of inheritance and betrayal and late-night decisions made while kneading dough. Desmond closed the last folder and leaned back in his chair. What do you want to do next? I had spent 19 days setting an elaborate trap, 5 years building an empire worth $31 million, 10 years mourning my wife, and in the end, the only thing I wanted was to stand in a kitchen with flour on my hands and remember why any of it had ever mattered. A bake, I said. Desmond looked at me across his mahogany desk, like he was waiting for the real answer. Expansion plans, acquisition targets, succession strategies. But there was no other answer. After everything, I was still just a baker, and I was ready to go home. 6 weeks after my daughter's arrest, a letter arrived from Plymouth County Correctional Facility with handwriting I'd known since she was 7 years old. Home had become something different in the weeks since August. Not smaller exactly, just quieter. The Victorian house no longer felt like it was waiting for someone to return. It had accepted that the waiting was over. I'd returned to work at the flagship bakery 3 mornings a week. Let Eugene handle the financial reports I used to scrutinize, stop checking my phone for messages that would never come. The envelope sat on the kitchen table for most of the October morning. Plymouth County Correctional Facility, printed in block letters across the return address. Celine Marie Harrington, inmate number beneath her name. I made coffee and sat at the table looking past the envelope to the harbor beyond the bay window. The water was gray-blue that morning, autumn settling into the New England coastline, with the particular cold that comes in October. Fishing boats moved through the harbor in their familiar patterns out before dawn, back by mid-morning, the rhythm unchanged for 200 years. The coffee turned cold in my cup before I finally reached for the envelope. It was thin. Not a long letter then. I opened it carefully, the paper tearing along the seal with a sound that seemed too loud in the silent kitchen. Inside was a single piece of paper. Not standard stationery, something smaller, torn from a notebook maybe. The handwriting was Celine's, but smaller than I remembered, more controlled. I unfolded it and read, "Dad, I found Mom's scrap of paper in the pocket of the jacket I was wearing that morning. I must have moved it from my nightgown before they took my things. I don't remember when I took it from your desk drawer. Maybe years ago. Maybe just before everything happened. I've read it every night since I found it. When the dough rises correctly, I know you've done it right. I am sorry, Dad. Not to ask forgiveness, I know what I did and I know what I deserve. Just because this is the only true thing I have left to say. S." I read it twice, then a third time. She'd had Helena's note. The farewell message Helena had written in October 2014, 1 week before lung cancer, took her the note I'd kept in my desk drawer for 10 years and read on the hard mornings when grief felt too heavy to carry alone. Celine had taken it at some point, years ago, or months ago, she didn't know which, and carried it with her through whatever path had led her to pour toxin into flour at 3:47 on an August morning. She'd had her mother's words in her pocket while planning her father's murder. I didn't know what that meant. Maybe it meant she'd forgotten the note was there, lost in old jacket lining, while Corbin poisoned her judgment. Or maybe it meant some small part of her had needed to carry Helena's voice, even as she betrayed everything Helena had taught her about love and family, and the difference between what we want and what we're willing to destroy to get it. I folded Celine's letter and stood walking to Helena's secretary desk in the corner. The drawer opened smoothly. I'd oiled the runners just last month, maintaining the furniture the way she'd taught me to maintain everything with attention and care, and the understanding that good things lasted only if you took responsibility for their preservation. Helena's original note was exactly where I'd kept it for 10 years, in a small cedar box beside old photographs and the deed to our first bakery location. I placed Celine's letter beside it. 2 scraps of paper in a drawer, one from a woman who'd loved me enough to leave me instructions for living, and one from a daughter who'd loved me too little to stop herself from trying to kill me, and somehow both notes said the same thing: I'm sorry. I closed the drawer. The first week of October brought the kind of bright cold mornings that make Gloucester Harbor look like a postcard. On Monday, I met Eugene at the Harbor Bakery location, not the flagship store, but the smaller cafe we'd opened 2 years ago, with windows overlooking the water and a dozen tables where tourists and locals mixed during breakfast hours. We sat by the window with fresh bread and black coffee, watching fishing boats navigate the morning harbor traffic. The bread was sourdough, not my recipe, but close. One of the apprentice bakers had been experimenting with longer fermentation times, and the result was good. Different but good. Eugene tore a piece from the loaf and chewed thoughtfully, his eyes on the water. Did Helena like sitting here? It was the first time in 10 years anyone had asked about Helena, as simple morning conversation without the weight of tragedy or the careful tone people use when mentioning the dead. She did, I started to say, but Eugene continued before I could finish. She used to sit and read here as a young girl. Well, not this exact building, it was a tackle shop back then, 1970s. But this spot. She always said Gloucester Harbor in the morning looked like an oil painting, light hitting the water just right. I looked at the water. The morning light on Gloucester Harbor was exactly the color Helena had always described gold, with hints of rose and pale blue like watercolor bleeding across canvas, and for the first time in a decade, I could look at it without my chest tightening. She did, I said again. She was always right about things like that. Eugene smiled slightly and took another piece of bread. We said nothing more for a long time. The gulls circled overhead, calling to each other in their harsh voices. Boat engines hummed in the distance. The cafe filled slowly with morning customers, contractors getting coffee, before job sites, elderly couples reading newspapers, a young mother with 2 children who fought over the last blueberry muffin. Ordinary Monday morning, October in Massachusetts, life continuing the way it always had, the way it always would. We sat there for nearly an hour, Eugene and I watching the fishing boats move through the harbor and the gulls circle overhead. Not talking about betrayal or conspiracy or prison sentences, just 2 men sharing breakfast the way Helena's brother and I might have done 40 years ago, if we'd known each other then. The way we could do from now on. In December, 4 months after my daughter went to prison and 10 years after my wife died, I finally gave Helena the legacy she'd always deserved. The 9th Golden Crust branch opened on Newbury Street in Boston on a crisp December morning when frost still clung to the windows and the city smelled like winter. The storefront was larger than our original Gloucester location, floor-to-ceiling glass, exposed brick, the kind of upscale bakery that belonged in Boston's most expensive shopping district. But what mattered wasn't the location or the square footage. What mattered was etched into the glass above the entrance in letters 3 inches tall, the Golden Crust, Est, 2019, in memory of Helena. The same dedication had been added to all 9 branches overnight. Gloucester Flagship, Salem, Marblehead, Rockport, Beverly, Manchester, Ipswich, Danvers, and now Boston. Eugene had coordinated the installation crews personally, ensuring every location received identical etching at exactly the same hour, so that when the sun rose on December 1st, Helena's name appeared across the North Shore simultaneously. I stood on the sidewalk with Eugene beside me, both of us staring at the letters. December wind came off the Charles River, cold enough to make my eyes water. Or maybe that was something else. She would have been proud, Eugene said quietly. 10 years too late, but finally her name where it belonged. Not hidden in a desk drawer or whispered in an empty kitchen, but etched in glass for everyone to see. The woman who'd taught me that good bread required patience, that love meant seeing people clearly, that a life built on honest work was worth more than any amount of money someone else tried to steal. I raised the ceremonial scissors, ridiculous tradition, but the investors expected it and cut the red ribbon stretched across the entrance. The doors slid open and the scent of fresh sourdough poured onto Newbury Street, carried by warmth from the ovens inside. People began filing in. Young couples, business professionals, on their way to offices, tourists with cameras. They came for the bread, but they'd see Helena's name first. That was enough. On an ordinary Monday later that December, I woke at 4 a.m. the way I'd done for 40 years and drove through dark streets to the Gloucester Harbor Bakery. The flagship location now, though I still thought of it as simply the bakery, the place where Helena and I had started everything, when we were young and foolish enough to believe a good recipe was all you needed. The kitchen was exactly as I'd left it the night before. Steel counters cleaned and sanitized, flour bins filled. Sourdough starter, bubbling quietly in its ceramic crock, the culture descended from the original batch Helena had cultivated in 1984. I tied on the apron hers still after all these years and began the first batch. The flour handprint I left on the steel counter at 4 a.m. looked identical to the one I'd left 5 months ago when this nightmare began, but that handprint had marked the last morning of my old life, and this one marked the first morning of everything that came after. Same motion, same kitchen, same work. Everything different. My phone rested on the steel shelf where I always kept it screen dark. No unexpected call this morning. No daughter's voice asking to come home. No conspiracy texts between Corbin and corporate buyers. Just silence and the sound of dough hitting the counter in steady rhythm. The phone buzzed once at 6:30. Eugene's text, coffee at 7. I wiped flour from my hands and typed back, as usual. 3 words. Ordinary words. The kind of exchange that happens 1,000 times across the country every morning between people who've built friendship out of shared routine. But they meant something more now that I knew Eugene was family. Helena's brother, my brother-in-law, the guardian who'd spent 5 years watching over me without ever asking for recognition. I returned to the dough. Good dough requires time to rise. You cannot force it. You cannot fake it. It rises only when it's ready, correct temperature, right environment, patient hands, that know when to work it and when to let it rest. Took me 60 years to realize this rule doesn't merely apply to bread. At 4:30 that afternoon, Eugene and I stood outside the bakery with coffee mugs watching the sun dip below the harbor. December light came in, slanted in gold, the kind of illumination that makes everything look softer than it is. A young man, maybe 21, university sweatshirt under his winter coat, emerged from the bakery clutching a warm sourdough loaf wrapped in paper. He paused when he saw me standing there. "You're the man who bakes this." He held up the loaf like evidence. "Best thing I've ever eaten. What's the secret, Doripes?" Marcus Thornton, 21-year-old Boston University literature student, had stopped at the Golden Crust on his way to evening class because the smell of fresh bread reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen. He didn't know he was asking a man who'd spent the last 5 months surviving his daughter's murder plot. He just wanted to know how to make good bread. I looked at my coffee mug, at the harbor where fishing boats rocked gently in their slips, at the storefront gleaming in sunset light with Helena's name etched in glass catching the last rays. Then I looked back at the young man. "Time," I said, "patience, and knowing exactly what is worth keeping." He nodded slowly the way young people do. When they hear wisdom, they don't quite understand yet, but sense might matter later. He thanked me and walked away down the street, the bread tucked under his arm. Eugene took a sip of coffee. "He'll understand later." Perhaps. The December light on Gloucester Harbor was the exact color Helena had always described, gold bleeding into rose and pale blue, and standing there with Eugene watching it fade, I understood finally that some things are worth 60 years to learn. I walked back through the doors of the Golden Crust as the last light faded from the harbor. Tomorrow, I would wake at 4 a.m. and need the first batch. Eugene would text at 6:30. We would have coffee at 7. The bread would rise at its own pace, the way it always had, the way it always would. Some stories don't end, they just become the ordinary rhythm of a life worth living. And that finally was enough. And to you, listening to my story, remember this: revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about protecting what matters most. I spent 40 years building a legacy I thought my daughter would cherish. My mistake wasn't trusting her, it was not seeing the signs when trust started to break. Don't wait until poison is in your flour to ask the hard questions. Look at the people closest to you and ask yourself, do they love what you've built or just what it's worth? This story isn't just about a dad's family revenge, it's about knowing when justice requires mercy and when love requires consequences. The lesson I learned lying on that floor: some things take 60 years to understand. Time, patience, knowing what's worth keeping. I believe God put me through that darkness so I could see what Helena taught me all along. Legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in how you choose to love when love becomes impossible. Even Dad's family revenge can be an act of grace. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done in my position? Would you have chosen justice, mercy, or walked away entirely? Drop a comment below and share your honest thoughts. If this story moved, you please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dad's Calm Revenge for more stories like this one, thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more to me than you know. One final note: certain details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or situations is purely coincidental. What I hope stays with you is the message and the reminder that even in our darkest moments, we get to choose who we become.